Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Does this work? All right. So I'd like to start off by telling you a story about a guy named Dan. So can you? All right. This is Dan. This is Dan on his first day of work, actually, and I think he looks pretty happy, right? He just got a new MacBook, and the office makes great coffee, and it's sunny outside, and life is good. Well, this is Dan 2 months later. He looks kind of sad, doesn't he? Sitting on the floor, and his hair grew out, and well, life doesn't seem so good anymore. You may wonder, what happened, Dan? Well, it's pretty easy. 2 words. Legacy software. It's bad. Well, thankfully, we're here today, and we're going to help Dan untangle this mess by writing a custom IDE extension. All right, so for those of you who don't know me, I was introduced already, but I'm Max. I've worked on legacy software in the past, but currently I work with NX, and I'm building NX Console, which is a VSCode extension and JetBrains plugin. Hopefully I'm the right person to begin with this talk. All right, so all of you probably work with one of these editors. If you're not, then please tell me afterward what you're working with, because it's probably wild. But all of these editors allow you to extend their functionality in some way. So I kept the talk of this title IDE agnostic on purpose, because a lot of what I'm going to talk about applies to not just VS Code, but all the small ones too. But I will be focusing on VS Code today because it is by far the most widely used, and I happen to think that the API is pretty good for it. It's very simple and concise and great for a demo. So yeah, I'm going to start with talking a little bit about VS Code and how you build extensions with it, and then we'll be talking about a little bit about NX, because we'll be using it to build our extension. All right, so let's get started. Something you might not actually know is that a lot of what we think of as VS Code core functionality is actually just VS Code extensions. So I tried taking a picture of this, a screenshot, but it turned out to be 4 screenshots, because this is all the extensions that the VS Code team themselves maintain in the VS Code repo. So a lot of what we think as core functionality is just extensions. I have some examples of this. For example, the Markdown preview when you're editing .md files, or the source control window you've all probably seen. That is just extensions. And they're using the same API that you and I are going to use today. So it's really powerful. I have some examples. I don't have some examples. So how do you build a VS Code extension? It's pretty simple. You need 2 things. You need a manifest file, which you see on the left. You need an activate function. So the manifest file is kind of the VS Code team's fancy way of saying package.json. So they have all the normal stuff in there. There's dependencies and def dependencies, maybe some scripts, a name, all the normal stuff. But they also have this contributes array. And the contributes array defines what your extension contributes to VS Code functionality. So in my case, I have a command that says hello world. And then on the other side, you see the activate function. And that is called once at startup. And it defines the actual logic of your code. So you can see there's a callback there. I'm hooking into the commands API that VS Code provides. And when the user executes my hello world command, I'll be showing an information message saying hello world. It's pretty simple. And this is, 10 lines of code. That's all you need really to have a fully functioning VS Code extension. So it's pretty simple. To give you some more examples of what you can do, here is a screenshot I took from the VS Code docs themselves. And that's not an exhaustive list, but it shows some of the things you can do and some of the things you can add to VS Code using an extension. You can see there's things you can add to the toolbar. You can add view containers with whole different views on the left. You can add custom editors. There's all kinds of things you can do. You can use a lot of the UI patterns that VS Code themselves expose, like the quick picks to make a quick selection. In this case, you can select a code space. You can show information messages. There's some errors or notifications or warnings. And then those might have actions that the user can respond to them. And there's context menus. So maybe you want to provide some specific actions for a specific file type, in this case, git ignore files. All right, so that's a quick intro to VS Code. Now let's get over to NX. So for those of you who don't know what NX does, you might have seen a lot of terms floating around there about what people think NX is and what NX actually is. Monorepos is a really popular one, remote caching, task orchestration, and NX is a very powerful tool and it does a lot of things, but today we'll be focusing mainly on two aspects. So the first one is NX plugins. As all of you know, development is hard. So especially in the front-end or JavaScript space, there are so many tools you need to learn about. So many tools you have to figure out how to use. Just in this talk alone, to build this quick demo extension, we're going to be using ESBuild to bundle our extension, ESLint and Prettier, and of course TypeScript to make sure our code looks good and works. And I'm not even going to get started with testing, but there's a litany of tools you could be using to test your code. So what NX does is it provides a way to interact with all these tools so that you don't have to think about it so much. It removes a lot of overhead for you. And NX plugins integrate all these tools, and they give you mainly two things. There's more, but mainly two things. The first one being generators. So a generator is a way to programmatically update your code. So for example, if you want to use ESLint, you don't have to go to the docs and read, how do I add ESLint to my project? I need to create some config file, and I need to run something in the CLI. You just tell NX, hey, please add an ESLint to my project, and it does it for you. And the second thing being executors. Executors are a way to wrap these tools and run commands for you, execute commands for you. So for example, instead of going to the docs and figuring out, how do I run ESBuild, what config files do I need, what CLI commands I need to run, you tell NX, please run ESBuild and bundle my code, and it does it for you. So that's really powerful. And the second thing that we're going to be focusing on today that NX gives you is structure. So I don't know if you remember that activate function I showed you earlier a couple of slides ago. That's all there is to an extension. And as you can imagine, it doesn't really scale well. So as I keep building more features and my extension grows, that's going to be a really long activate function. So I need some way to make sure that it's maintainable and scalable, because I'm not going to keep track of a 2,000-line function. So with NX, you can modularize your code. You can break certain pieces out into well-defined structured libraries, and then NX can help you visualize those, as you see on the left, and then also run a lot of optimization so your code remains fast at scale. All right, so that's a quick NX intro. Let's go back to Dan and his problems. So I was exaggerating a little bit earlier, I admit. Maybe it isn't that bad. So what Dan doesn't have is a cool, fancy internationalization library that helps him run his code, translate the strings. What Dan does have is a REST API that returns a big JSON object. And he has a translate function that someone wrote 10 years ago, and this great UI he can access in some obscure intranet somewhere to update those translation strings. We're not going to get into that. But what we're going to do is so the thing is, Dan isn't going to go to his manager and get 3 sprints off to rework the entire internationalization system. And maybe he shouldn't have to, because it works. It's not very elegant, but it works. But we're going to help him make his life easier and make his team's life easier by building an extension, which is a way smaller task. So what we're going to do is we're going to write an extension that can ping the server, get all these translations from the JSON file, and then provide autocomplete for him. So as he types, he will know what keys there are, what he can translate. And then we'll also build a explorer. So he can go into the IDE, he can look at all the translations available, and maybe he can find the right one he needs for his button that he's writing or whatever he's doing. All right, so let's get started. Okay. Here we go. So I will start off with scaffolding my extension. There's a command from a little plugin I wrote, create VSCode extension, and this runs an NX generator under the hood. So this is what I was talking about. This is going to scaffold all the files you need without a lot of work, and I'm going to call it Dan's extension. And the Wi-Fi isn't super great, so I'm just going to pretend to hit this and go over here, where I actually did it earlier in my room. So I hope that's okay. And let's have a look at what was generated here. So this is a lot of tooling files that you know and love to see. A little bit messy, but that's okay. And here in the package.json, you can see the manifest file I was talking about earlier. So this contributes array, a contributes object with the commands and the hello world command. Then here in source main TS, you can see the activate function. This is exactly the screenshot I showed you earlier, so it shouldn't come as a surprise for you. So before we start building all the new stuff, let's just look at what this looks like right now. Here in our .VSCode, there's also a launch configuration generated for us, which means we can run the extension and debug it. But first we need to build it. As I was talking about earlier, we're using esbuild. So here in project.json, this is kind of like an access way of defining package.json scripts with more configuration, and it's more powerful. You can see there's a build target. And then there's a watch mode. I can run it. And this will just continuously build as I make changes in the background, so I can always have up-to-date artifacts. So this launch configuration that I showed you earlier, up here, this will give me a debug configuration I can run. And this will open the extension development host. I'm just going to move this one over. And this is basically an instance of VS Code that is running your extension. So it's really easy to write an extension and then try it out right away. So far, there isn't really anything in here, but I can run the command, the hello world command, hello world from Dan's extension. Then I click enter, and I see a little bit of a notification down here. So that works, that's nice. All right, let's get started on the actual features we want to build. So in my activate function, I'm going to admit this is very much premature optimization, but I want to use an X to break out this activate function into separate pieces. So I'm building a translation extension now, but Dan might have all kinds of features he needs to build for his team or for his company. And it's going to be a long activate function, as I said earlier. So I'm going to run nx-generate, and I can generate a library that will contain all my code related to the translation feature. So I'm going to name this translations, and I want to register this library in my main extension. I can generate it, and let's have a look at what changed. So you can see that now in activate, we're also activating the translations. And if I go in here, you'll see, is this fine, by the way? Do you see in the background? Should I make it bigger, or? It's fine, all right. So you see there's a separate folder created, translations, that does all my code just for the translations, and I can do extension things in here. So I will kind of cheat a little bit and copy this code in here, because it is early, and the demo gods aren't going to be with me today, I have a feeling, especially after yesterday. Let me just import this stuff. All right, so what are we doing here? You can see this is all the code we need for the autocomplete feature, and it's not a lot. So we're going to start off by pinging our API to get the translations. Then we're going to register a completion item provider. So what that does is, for every TypeScript or .tsx file, whenever we trigger the completions, so after you type a dot, for example, or command I, or command or control dot, depending on your system, this function will run. And what the function does is, in the current document, it checks the line we're at, it gets the text at the cursor, and then it looks at the text in front of the cursor and checks whether it matches this translate regular expression. And then if there's a match, we take all the translations we get, we map them into completion items and return those. So I'm going to refresh the extension development host. I'm going to go back in here, and you see that I was messing around with it earlier. And if I press Command I in my case, you'll see that all these translation keys are available. So maybe I want a message, and I can say message password reset. So that was pretty quick. Even if I hadn't cheated and used a snippet, that would have been pretty quick to write. And it provides a lot of value right out of the box for Dan, because he doesn't have to remember exactly what keys there are, and he's not going to make typos and have to go to this weird Windows 95 machine in the internet somewhere and find the keys, but he can just get autocomplete. So that's pretty cool already. All right, I'm going to commit this to make sure we can see the translations later. All right, so The next thing we wanted to do is build an explorer. So Dan can go in, look at all the translations available, and select the right one for him. So what I will do is I will generate a tree view. So a tree view is one of these things you see here. It's a pretty common pattern in VS Code. It's a tree, so you can have some nodes, you can expand them, and they have children. You can expand those or collapse them, and you will see it all over the place. In the plugin I have, there is a generator for this. So that's kind of the cool thing about NX generators, is that compared to a starter template you might use, you don't just use them once and then forget about them and have to deal with the decisions you've made. So with generators, you can kind of keep evolving your project as it goes on. So that's a whole other level that's to it. So I'll generate a tree view. I'm going to name it Translation Explorer. And I want to register the tree view in my translations project. Now, I need to register a view container. So view containers in VS Code are these things on the left. You can see there's a view container for GitLens here, and then there's a couple of distinct views that live in that view container. This is the same for NX Console and all the other explorers. So I'm going to name this view container Dan's extension, because he might be putting other stuff in there, and you kind of have to be careful not to put too many view containers in there because it gets really crowded very quickly. And then it will generate it. So let's see what changed. First of all, in the manifest file, we made some new definitions to set up our view container. We give it a name, we give it an icon, we set up our view, we make sure the view lives in that view container. And you could all do this, but that's kind of the cool thing about generators. You don't have to write all the boilerplate and go to the VS Code docs and learn how you can do it. Then we created this Translation Explorer provider. So that is a provider that defines the data that will be shown in your tree. And in our case, it's just a hello world example tree. And then in here, we're going to register the tree provider, and that kind of hooks up the view we defined in the manifest file with the data we will get in TypeScript. So let's refresh our extension development host, and you'll see this nice little circle view here, and then there's a hello world tree view. Not very exciting, but it works. So what are we going to do? First, we're going to get the translations again, and this time we'll get them in a nice and nested format, so they match the tree structure we have already. And I'm going to, you know what, first of all, I'm going to look at it. So that's another really cool thing about this whole extension development host. It's really nice to debug. So you can see I put a breakpoint here, I refreshed, my extension is loading in the background, and I hit the breakpoint, and I can just go through and see this is what the endpoint gave me. It's some translations. There's categories, so there's an error, messages category, and then separate keys in those categories and their translations. So I will pass this along to the provider, then make sure that the provider actually knows how to deal with it. So let's go over this code. What happens here? So with three providers, you can have any kind of data object you want. You could have some cool data structure you thought of, and then this getTreeItem function maps whatever data structure you have to an actual item that is going to be displayed, like here on the left. This is another one of those examples, by the way, of a tree view. This is just a tree view, and it's built with VS Code extensions by VS Code themselves in the debugger view. So there's a lot of extensions that just provide custom debuggers for different languages, like this one. All right, so getChildren is where the actual logic of our tree happens. So this will be called to, as the name says, get the children of our tree elements. In the beginning, it will be called with undefined to get all the root elements of our tree. So what we're going to do is, if it's called with undefined, we'll get all these categories, so errors, messages, miscellaneous, and we'll instantiate a tree item. We'll make sure it's a category. We'll give it a nice icon. We'll return it. Pretty simple. Then the next level, if we expand one of the categories, we need to get all the translation keys inside the category. So we'll get those keys. We'll create a tree item. We'll give it another icon to make sure they're distinguishable, and then we'll return it. And then finally, if we have both the category and the specific translation key, we will turn the actual translated string. We'll put the name inside a tree item, and we'll return it. So, I mean, this is 40 lines of code. I could probably make it more concise if I had more time, but it's pretty simple to write, and I feel like it's pretty logical too. So there's not a lot of weird API surface you have to cover. This seems pretty logical to step through. All right, so I will remove my breakpoint. I can refresh my extension. And here you'll see on the left, this is all the translations we have in the Explorer. So now Dan can go through, he can look at all the translations and see if maybe there's a fitting one that he needs for his cool new button that he's writing. So this is pretty simple, and this is actually alive, and it's going to update as the translations change in the backend. And yeah, that's my demo. All right. So I think what's cool about this is it didn't take a lot of time. And obviously I've done this before, so maybe it's going to be a little bit slower the first time. But compared to actually going and implementing a whole new translation system, this is very quick to hit the ground running, but very quick to provide a lot of value too. All right, so let's go on. So what I think is cool about this is you can do it in an afternoon. So this is how I got started with the VS Code extensions actually is, I'm going to take my clicker again. It was a hackathon, and we had this weird problem at our company, and I thought, hey, why not build a VS Code extension? It might help, and it took a day, and it was pretty valuable. So maybe you have some weird setups that you're facing at your company, and maybe I can inspire you to write a quick VS Code extension to it. All right, so this was very cool, but it was also just a prototype. So I want to go beyond the prototype and see what the point is and what we can do with VS Code extensions, or any IDE extensions in general. How am I on time? Be fine. All right, so one of the big things that VS Code extensions or any editor extensions allow you to do is reduce context switching. So it's proven that context switching takes a toll on the brain. And if you need to leave your IDE and you go to the browser and you look something up and then you go back and you're sitting there and thinking, what was I doing again? Where do I need to pick off? And that makes you less productive. And it's annoying, it's frustrating. So VS Code extensions allow you to reduce that context switching. So for example here, this is the NX graph. I showed you some of it earlier. And with NX console, we put it inside the editor. And that's cool, instead of going to the browser, but it's not the biggest deal. But one of the nice things is it has all the context of what you're working on currently. So let's say you're editing a file, and you're wondering, how does this file fit into the bigger picture of my workspace? So you can just run the command and open the NX graph that will show you all the different internal libraries and how they relate to each other based on the file you've currently opened. And that context of I'm editing this file right now is not available if you have a separate tool in the browser, for example. That's something that IDE extensions are very good at, giving you that context of what you're working on currently. This is another one of my favorite examples. I don't know if you're using this. It's a good graph extension. If you're not, you should definitely install it. It's really cool. I don't like git log, just the CLI command. It's kind of troublesome to use. And some people love the CLI, and some people will die by the CLI, and that's perfectly fine. But not everyone. I like the visual representation kind of. But I also don't want to install Git Kraken or some third-party tool, and then I have to switch again, and then I have to install and update software. And I don't need to. There's a perfectly fine extension right there that displays it in a nice visual way inside your editor, and it also benefits from that context you have that I was talking about earlier. So from here, I can look at the file changes in my editor. I can actually just edit the file right there with all the cool VS Code highlighting stuff that I have. So that wouldn't be possible with third-party tools, and it's really cool with VS Code extensions. All right. So another thing that VS Code extensions do is they smooth out workflows. This is the biggest thing down here, autocomplete. We wouldn't want to work without autocomplete anymore these days. It's super powerful and it's super important. And a lot of VS Code extensions do exactly just that. They provide autocomplete or IntelliSense for a specific language. I have some other examples here. For example, in the top, marked by the red arrows, You saw me using this earlier. So if I'm editing a project.json file, I'm messing around with the tests, maybe I want to change some config on how Jest is run or how I'm building my project, wouldn't it be cool if I could just run it too and see what the changes I made actually affected? Well, that's another cool thing that editor extensions, in this case it's called code lenses, in VS Code allow you to do. You have all the context right there and it's in the right place. You don't have to switch between editing and then remembering the command you're going to run, that you need to do it. It's all right there. And then I have a small example here, and here it's documentation. So if I'm hovering over an executor and I'm wondering what does it actually do, I can just click through to the documentation. And it's a small thing for sure, but that's kind of the point of extensions. It's a holistic thing that smooths out all these workflows. It reduces friction, and it allows you to provide a way better developer experience for your tools or for your team. All right, and I'm going to hammer this point home. This is the third thing. You can escape the CLI, kind of. The CLI is not for everyone, especially if you're new, maybe. It can be very intimidating. If I'm generating something complex, it's going to be, I don't know, 5 lines of CLI command, and then I make one typo, and I have to do it all over again, and I have to find the right. It can be frustrating. So why not just make it better? There's a UI we built. You can just go in there. There's some validation. You can get live preview. So as I type, you see what would happen if I ran it right now, and it's a really nice visual way that it's not for everyone, but a lot of people like it, and it's one of the strengths of VS Code extensions to not have to do everything in the CLI. Because, I mean, most VS Code extensions don't do anything necessarily new. They just provide a better way to do it. All right. So I've been promising that this talk wouldn't just be about VS Code, but I feel like I've been talking about VS Code a lot. So I'm going to go beyond VS Code and see how we can fit other editors into the entire equation. So I'll be using NX Console, which I built for work. I'm a little bit biased. To demonstrate this. We just moved from VS Code and we expanded NX Console to have support for all JetBrains editors, which is like 20. I don't know, they have so many editors. How do we do this? So we start off with the VS Code extension, right? This is nice. I spent all this time working on it. It's really cool. It was hard work. I need to talk to an X in some way. I get some information from the tool. I send some information back. And now I'm going to introduce another editor. I'm going to introduce JetBrains editors in there. That's nice. But those are written in Kotlin. This is written in TypeScript. It seems like I'm going to have to redo everything. And that seems like a lot of work that I don't want to do. So I still have to talk to NX, but there has to be a better way that means I don't have to rewrite everything. And there is. So what we do and what a lot of other extensions do is we use a language server. So language servers are built on a protocol. It's called the LSP. The language server protocol is by Microsoft. It was built for VS Code, and it provides an editor-agnostic way to provide all kinds of features like autocomplete, code navigation, code documentation, and custom things too. It's all built into the language server. So now I can write a language server. This is written in TypeScript in our case, but you can do anything. And that talks to NX. It gets information, it sends some commands to it. But what it allows us to do is for VS Code and JetBrains to be a thin wrapper on top. So I still have to program these editor-specific APIs, of course, in Kotlin and in TypeScript. But I don't have to redo all my work. This is really powerful, and it allowed us to expand our support from VS Code to 20 editors in a couple of months. And it's really powerful, and it will make it easy for us to expand to more editors in the future, maybe. All right, so that was it for me. If you have any questions, let me know.